Welcome back to Capital Considerations. I'm your host, Tony Roth, Chief Investment Officer for M&T Bank and Wilmington Trust. Today, we'll explore the evolving political and geoeconomic backdrop, particularly as it relates to the war in Iran and what it means for markets and decision makers. To help us in this conversation, I'm very pleased to welcome back a guest who we had in the past who was really exceptional, Teddy Bunzel. And it's funny, I was talking to Teddy about ensuring that I appropriately credentialized him, given how present and focused we all are on the Iranian war right now. And of course, Teddy has worked at the Treasury Department. He had worked at BlackRock for 10 years as their advisor for geopolitical affairs. And now he's in a similar role at Lazard. But Teddy, there was no better way that you could credentialize yourselves, but speaking a little Russian to us because you were in the Moscow embassy for a while. And as soon as you said those sentences in Russian, even though I had no idea what you were saying, I knew we were talking to the right guy.
Spasibo vam. Thank you.
With that, let me start, Teddy, today by again thanking you for joining us. I think that it's going to be a very interesting conversation that our clients are going to listen to rapidly, because it has such significance for all of us. I'm going to start with a little bit of a, if you will, devil's advocate type of perspective, which is to say that I do a lot of reading, I talk to a lot of people, and I think the conventional wisdom right now among people that seem to know the most is that the administration came into this, they made a decision predicated largely on events that happened, whether it be in Venezuela, whether it be in the attacks that happened last June, and the lack of a particularly problematic response on the part of the Iranians, if you will, and expected this to be a much shorter and successful engagement, if you will, than it has turned out to be so far. I think there is widely a perception that the U.S. is in a difficult position right now, the administration is in trouble, and that the Iranians have the upper hand in their control over the straits. Now, there's a lot to talk about, and I'm hoping that you're going to tell us that there's another perspective, that what I've just articulated is not at all the full picture. But with that backdrop, tell us what your take is and where you think the situation's going.
Look, put aside what Donald Trump has said about, whether or not there was an expectation that Iran would shut down the Strait of Hormuz through threats, through the use of force and attacking tankers, and, whether or not it was expected that Iran would lash out against Gulf states. I think that military planners and analysts who have watched this situation did anticipate that if the United States and Israel went for another campaign at the beginning of this year, especially in the wake of the protests that erupted in January, right? Which, remember, that was kind of the original catalyst that set this all in motion, that because of the threat to the regime, given that, when it's bundled up with these protests and calls for regime change, it becomes existential. And also the fact that I think the Iranians, to your point earlier, rightfully saw that in the exchange last summer, the 12-day war, they responded more cautiously and they didn't sufficiently deter the United States and Israel, that this time their response would be more forceful, and that the Gulf states' energy and other infrastructure, and also the shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, would be threatened. Now, I'm not sure whether or not either U.S. military planners or the Iranians understood just how effectively Iran would be able to effectively shut down, all traffic through the strait without having to lay a bunch of mines and physically put obstruction in the way of tankers. So they were able, really, through saber rattling and through the occasional attack, and through attacks on the Gulf states, to shut down over 90% of traffic. So maybe the effectiveness of their ability to do so was higher than anticipated, but I'm not sure for the analysts watching this in the U.S. government or in the military that the forcefulness and speed and breadth of the Iranian response was much of a surprise.
So what about the efficacy of their offensive assets? it seems as though, at least in the minds of the American public, it's a surprise that they've been able to, after in the fifth week of the war now, continue to really project force, whether it be through drones or missiles. There was some reporting of last week that maybe the U.S. assessed that they've gotten a third of the missiles. And then there's a question as to whether they're getting resupplied by Russia or whether they still are building things. I don't know. But is that surprising to anybody at this point that they are able to project that force? And indeed, to your point, continue to threaten and shut down the straits even this far into the conflict?
I'm not sure it's hugely surprising, especially when we have the example of the Houthi, kind of campaign where through asymmetric threats, I mean, not through a formal, military like the Iranians have, but through the threat of, drones and fast ships, they were able to really disrupt shipping. I don't think it's a surprise that Iran, with some of those tactics, even after their navy has largely been, put out of action, they've suffered tremendous damage of conventional military assets, even much of their ballistic missile and other shorter range missile capabilities, both the missiles themselves, but also crucially the launchers. I don't think it is a surprise that as long as you have some capability to continue to fire drones and fire missiles, and they, thousands of missiles across a number of different ranges. And, it's also important to remember that during the 12-day war, most of the focus was on the ballistic missile capability. That's what the Israelis were most focused on in particular, because that's what threatens Israel. But Iran has, other shorter range missile capabilities, which are on display that were comparatively less hit. They had thousands of missiles, they had thousands of drones, which not only are very hard to kind of disrupt across the board or find and destroy all of them before they're launched, but Iran has the ability to manufacture these things pretty cheaply and quickly, the Shahed drones in particular. So it's replenishing itself as this thing goes on. I don't think it is a huge surprise just that they are able to continue to fire capabilities off here and there. Now their ability to do so is being degraded by the U.S. and Israeli military, and a lot of those assets are being shot down by our military, by Gulf state air defense. And as the U.S. military campaign continues over the coming weeks, their ability to continue firing these things, in theory, will be degraded even further. But it will be very hard to get to a point where they have nothing left to fire. And remember, for tankers and for shipping, they're going to be reluctant to go through the strait with any sort of threat without appropriate U.S. military protection or escort.
So, given that, it doesn't seem like we're getting our way, if you will, from a military standpoint. In other words, do you agree with the statement that the Iranians, given that they have the ability to send these drones and hit a ship a day, that's all it takes, that would potentially going through there, they sort of have the upper hand here as it relates to a president that is seemingly very, very keen to end this conflict and get the straits open.
Yeah. So here's what I would say, and here's how I would think about it. From a military campaign perspective, what the United States is, focused on, it seems right now, is essentially two big things. One is continuing to pound and degrade Iranian, military capabilities, its ability to project force, but also to fire these missiles and drones. So it'll be very hard, if not impossible, to get to zero threat, but they're continuing to chip away the longer that this goes on. And so, in weeks from now, Iran's ability to continue this will be diminished. It won't be zero, but it'll be diminished from where it is today. That's number one. Number two is the military's, it looks like they're going to, they're focusing on trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So what that means is, practically speaking, is going after a lot of the targets in and around the strait, including a lot of the asymmetric capabilities that Iran has, the IRGC has, with fast boats, and other ships that could disrupt traffic. Put aside the kind of regular Iranian navy, but some of these asymmetric capabilities are going after shoreline batteries and reducing Iran's ability to threaten the strait, likely with the goal of reducing the level so that the U.S. is able to deploy naval convoys to start to get some energy flow through the strait. And that won't be free flow, like where we were pre-February 28th. There will be likely a U.S. Navy escort that will only be able to do a number of runs a day. It will likely prioritize energy tankers over some of the other commodities that flow through the strait. But in some weeks' time, we may have a situation in which there is some traffic flowing through force from the United States government. And while that isn't something that the U.S. can do just in perpetuity, it will change the dynamic from where we are today, where Iran has complete control and leverage in shutting down the strait. The U.S. forcibly reopening it and beginning some energy supply will provide a little bit of a release valve on energy prices, maybe reduce some of the growing economic pressure, but also symbolically change the dynamic to say that the U.S. can thwart Iran's ability to unilaterally shut down any traffic. And that may set the table if Iran is feeling enough military pressure from the intense bombardment from both the U.S. and Israel. And we can't put aside just how much pressure they're under right now militarily, the Iranians, that combine that plus the strait opening, you may, in the best case scenario, that creates the conditions for some sort of ceasefire that then allows this to slowly begin to normalize and traffic begin to resume.
So assuming that we don't get a ceasefire otherwise, what's the likelihood? Is this your base case scenario? And let's say by the end of April, that we'll be able to get that kind of activity through? Or is it a pipe dream? I mean, let's assume that a
No,
ceasefire does not emerge between now and the end of April. What's the probability of what you're describing, Teddy?
it's very hard in this just because everything's moving around to assign probabilities of high confidence. But I would say as you get to the end of April, beginning of May, having a situation in which the US has continued to really degrade Iran's capabilities through going after its defense industrial base and military assets, and also has forcibly reopened the strait to allow for these convoys. I think that is plausible. It won't be without risk that these convoys will go through. They'll still be subject to potential strikes, drones, and missiles, but the U.S. can help to take care of that with air defense assets aboard ships that help to convoy energy tankers through the strait. And so, if that's the case, that again may create a dynamic that is more conducive to a ceasefire in which the US and Iran agree to guns down and that they respect the transit of the strait. Maybe in a best case scenario, the US, there's some sort of an agreement on the nuclear program or other issues that have been part of negotiations. That'll be really difficult to do under fire, but I think, it's not impossible. And then you would, from there, you start to begin to have a normalization, though that will take some time, just given how many barrels are shut in right now in the Gulf. It's something like 10 million barrels a day of shut in production. Shippers are going to be a little hesitant to go through even the day after the declaration of some sort of ceasefire. But I would keep in your mind, just given that you said end of April, that Trump and Xi have rescheduled their meeting for May 14th and 15th. And the administration and the president have been explicit that they hope to have things wound down by then, before that meeting. So that's one timeline to keep in mind.
Do you have a level of concern around the ability of the U.S. to continue to prosecute this war, given our own limitations of artillery or munitions, smart weapons, whatever it may be?
Look, I'm not privy to any information, and I'm not a air defense or air interceptor kind of expert. But I will say my mental model here is the U.S. has the ability through existing stockpiles to prosecute this for the foreseeable future. The trade-offs are just in how much it's depleting now, the longer it goes on, and therefore how long it will take to replenish those stockpiles. And that intervening period will potentially, first of all, it's expensive to, replenish those stockpiles, but it also potentially leaves, the United States a little bit more vulnerable in, let's say, the Asia Pacific, if they have to draw down resources that otherwise would be deployed in any sort of escalation there, or maybe it cuts into the ability of the US to supply air defense to the Ukrainians, even if the Europeans are paying for it. And so you start to get military trade-offs, but I don't think that the US is like at risk of running out anytime soon,
Okay.
if that's the question.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it was. So thank you.
Both,
So,
and by the way, both offensive, right? Offensive missiles, but also air defense, right? Those are the two
right.
different items that are most important. Tomahawk missiles, Patriot air defense missiles, that kind of.
Okay. So it's very hard to evaluate with this president narrative from reality and intention. He talked most recently about if the straits are not open immediately, so on, he's going to, and there's not a serious advancement of the negotiations, he was going to essentially take down the energy and electrical infrastructure of Iran. I guess there's two questions around that. Number one is I'm perplexed on why he says things like that because he doesn't seem to follow through with them. And it just seems as though his own credibility is diminishing. But more fundamentally, am I misreading it? Would he do that? And if he did that, would that make sense? Would that be a good strategic thing to do?
I would say that if he did that and went after energy infrastructure, then you're talking about, from an economic perspective, a kind of the worst case scenario where you have a real energy escalation, because the response from Iran, they've been very clear in telegraphing this, is that they would go after Gulf state
Right.
energy infrastructure and production refineries, export infrastructure in ways that they haven't yet. And that would create a longer term impairment of supply that would cause an immediate spike in energy prices, but then
Mhm.
also create a more enduring stagflationary shock. So put aside whether that's strategically the right thing to do and whether that would help accomplish the military and political objectives Trump may ultimately, if he has maximalist, intentions in mind in terms of crippling, the regime economically, that would certainly go away toward achieving that goal, but it would carry a lot of economic risk. And that's not, at least my own base case, is that he'll follow through on that because of the really negative economic effects. And you can tell the White House is already feeling some of the pressure from rising gasoline prices, and energy prices generally. And so what I would say is, on just the tactics, this is the same playbook that Trump has used in all the different trade wars over the last year or so. And there are many instances that you could point to in which he doesn't necessarily follow through. I would say the threat to do exactly this, go after energy infrastructure, that's one example. But given that he followed through on these strikes, given the 12-day war, given the operation in Venezuela, you can't completely dismiss the possibility that he will follow through, but it is a tried and true kind of Trump playbook to just maximally threaten escalation and hope to get a concession. And, he's clearly using that approach now.
Let's pivot to the idea of détente that may be underway as we speak. Do you have a sense of whether or not, when the president says that they're desperate for a deal and they are begging us for a deal and that they've agreed to many of the demands within our 15 points, that they're even talking to us? My sense is, from what I read, that there's some message passing going on back and forth. And at best, perhaps the more moderate constituency within Iran that does not control the real military assets, which is the president, but not the Republican Guard, maybe who is indicating some room for negotiation, but there's not a lot of reality around a negotiation right now with the people that are really controlling the military assets, the Republican Guard, which is what seems to matter. And that's why you're getting this potentially almost schizophrenic set of statements from the president, where on the one hand, the negotiations are going great, on the other hand, he's going to destroy everything if he doesn't get what he wants immediately.
It's hard to know exactly what's happening inside the Iranian regime right now. I would assume that communication among the different elements of the regime is pretty difficult under this intense bombardment. It does seem that the administration does have back channel discussions going on, whether that's direct back channel or whether that's through intermediaries. Pakistan has obviously emerged as a key intermediary, but Turkey and Saudi Arabia seem to also be involved. Whether or not they're speaking directly, there does seem to be at least some sort of channel, and both sides are posturing. I mean, you heard Trump say the Iranians are begging for a deal. The Iranians say the Americans are begging for a deal. And look, obviously the United States is feeling economic pressure, and Trump would like to find some sort of an off ramp that allows for some declaration of victory and extraction of concessions on the nuclear program, ballistic missile program, and obviously an overall degradation of Iran's military capability and ability to project power. Again, I mentioned this before, it's important to remember the Iranians too are suffering a lot. And they already suffered a lot in the 12-day war last year. They've had their essentially a proxy network dismantled by the Israelis. And so they're also hurting. This who's puffing up their chests the most and saying that they don't need a deal, the other side's begging for it. I think that there is truth that both sides would like this to end. They're just trying to figure out in the right terms. I will say that on the substance of any sort of, more comprehensive agreement around the missile program, nuclear program, opening of the strait, sanctions relief, all that stuff, it seems that the two sides are very far apart. So we're nowhere close to any sort of big comprehensive deal. But does that mean that, in a few weeks' time, at the end of April, they can't come to at least some preliminary ceasefire agreement? No. All right. I think that they still can. Again, it is our base case. It's not a super high conviction, but it's our base case that still is the most likely outcome. Is that after a month or so, both sides will want to call it quits. The U.S. will feel the pressure. They'll come to some sort of an arrangement, or the U.S. will declare victory, and then we'll have this wind down. But there's obviously the risk of escalation that we all have to worry about.
Sure. But, what I haven't heard you talk about is any kind of serious, without further military pressure and pain on both sides, any kind of serious agreement, detente in the short term. It sounds like that's very unlikely.
Personally, I think that's unlikely.
What about the Marines, the paratroopers that the U.S. has now put in the region? It seems like it's a very small number, that it wouldn't be material to the overall conflict. Now, again, I'm a layperson, but when I hear about, a million soldiers in Iran ready to
Yeah.
attack anybody that sets foot on the Carrig Island, it seems as though that wouldn't be very smart for us to do, or even to try to put some Marines into the coastal area around the strait. But I don't know anything about this. Can you talk to us about why he's done this? Is it just posturing, or do you think that there's some reality that they would be used? And if they were used, is there a reasonable path for them to be used, those assets, those soldiers, where we could get some type of acceptable benefit relative to the risk of death that we create for those Americans?
Look, I would just say, without being privy to anything here, it seems to me, I mean, I agree with you that the overall level, right, of U.S. forces, something like now 50,000 that are in total in the region after the surge of Marines, the 82nd Airborne. I mean, it's a far cry from the number of troops that went into Iraq, in a country that's much smaller, and less sophisticated than Iran, a country of 90 million people. And so any sort of major ground operation, like a regime change operation, that's not what these forces would be used for. Instead, my assumption is that they are offering the president, options on the ability to follow through on threats to seize certain islands, whether card or otherwise, as a way to gain leverage, cut off Iranian exports. Or neutralize potential military threats to shipment through the strait. It wouldn't come without risk. Obviously, they would become targets, or they could be used to go after potential threats to the strait, the emanating from the shoreline of the Strait of Hormuz on the Iranian side. We don't know. They also could be just used in a way, negotiating ploy, right, to hold the specter out of a potential ground force incursion or escalation with troops, as a way to put further pressure on the Iranian regime in negotiations, or to agree to some sort of ceasefire. And so, overall, I think it is more about providing optionality to the president than an indication of any sort of major imminent plans. So, we don't know.
But when you think about the optionality that it's providing, and I hate to put you on the spot here. Do you think that there's a constructive, reasonable use within the context of the military conflict where, I mean, do you think that it would make sense for them to try to take care of Ireland, and could they do it with this group of Marines? I mean, is there any view around that?
My assumption is that they're assembling the forces that would be necessary to take Cargill. And I don't know whether these Marines are the kind of constellation of assets around the region. I don't think that they've made a decision on it, on any of that. Look, they could be used when you think about the other ways around beyond a seizure of Cargill. And you can imagine if there's some sort of threat, as I mentioned before, on the coastline of Iran, hugging the strait, that they feel is most easily, neutralized through a temporary ground incursion or to seize a certain piece of land. Maybe they're used for that purpose. But again, I think that it may well be that if we're kind of reviewing this a month from now, 2 months from now, there are no ground forces deployed, and this really was about creating more leverage and pressure, and also just giving the president an option in case things did start to escalate and they needed the ability to deploy troops.
Okay, let's pivot and move to the nuclear material. Do you, given everyone you speak to, et cetera, is there any reasonable concern that they have or are in the process of taking the 60% material to 90%, which is enough for a weapon in terms of the richness of the material? And even if they did have that material and they had the means to deliver it through a missile, do they actually have the technological means to put it into the device? What's the imminence of all of that, and what's the concern around that in the short term, this year, let's just say during this conflict?
So, I mean, this gets back to the aftermath of the 12-day war and what their capabilities were. I mean, my impression in reading the tea leaves and kind of all the same things that you are is that the 60% enriched uranium is buried under some of the rubble and in the tunnels of facilities that were destroyed last summer, and that it hasn't yet been recovered. That the Iranians probably know where it is. The IAEA has indicated that it thinks that that's where some of that highly enriched uranium is, and so my assumption is they haven't yet made a move to recover that material in earnest. If they did, first of all, I would assume, just given the penetration that especially the Israelis have had and on the Iranian regime and the nuclear program, that we would catch wind of that. And then number two, in terms of getting it to then 90% enriched uranium, that's something that it would require further enriching it. And, Iran can manufacture its own centrifuges, probably has still some left even after last summer's attack. So I assume that if they really wanted to make a dash, that they could enrich it up to 90% after they recover it. They'd have to do it in a facility that is detected by, intelligence, which will be a challenge, but, they have the know-how and the material ability to do it. And then there's the question of how long it takes to actually then weaponize it, right? And put it on a warhead of some kind. And it does seem that they are, some of that activity was centered around facilities that were struck last summer. So we'd have to reconstitute that. But, the challenge is that a lot of the knowledge of the program, it's knowledge that's living in the heads and the kind of records of the individuals involved. So you can't just destroy all of it, right? Some of that knowledge will live on. So, while I don't know exactly how long it would take to weaponize, I mean, some of the estimates, last time around, around the time of the strikes, in June, were that, it'd take, I don't know, 6 months to a year to weaponize to highly enriched uranium. So there still would be some lag. I don't think we're at risk of some imminent declaration that Iran is a fully capable nuclear weapon, but they still have all the constituent parts, right? It would take some time to reconstitute, and they've been set back. But if they determined that against the will of the international community in the US and Israel, they wanted to race to a bomb, they could. Doesn't seem likely that they'd get there within 2026, but they would ultimately have the ability to do so.
Do you think that there's any line in the sand relative to the nuclear capability of the country for Trump and the administration? Do you think that they wouldn't accept a resolution that does not involve the removal of the material or very significant commitments as it relates to the International Atomic Energy Commission, or do you think that at this point, if Trump can get the straits back open and he'll declare victory no matter what happens, we all know that he would potentially accept some relatively unsatisfying, outcome as it relates to the nuclear
Yeah.
material?
I think that the preference would obviously be that whatever the closing is, there is some sort of a comprehensive agreement or some sort of resolution related to that. But it depends upon the economic pressure that the administration is feeling. And you could construct a scenario in which after the military campaign keeps going on for weeks, they forcibly reopen the strait. Energy prices keep creeping up and up. The pressure keeps continuing. And both sides agree to a ceasefire that allows, the US and Iran to declare some sort of victory. And then they leave the kind of resolution of the nuclear program to subsequent discussions. I mean, I think that that's a totally feasible outcome. And whether or not that does lead ultimately to a comprehensive deal or not is unclear, but it will at least create a path for a resolution and allow the Trump administration to kind of tout that they're, not only have they opened the strait and they've totally defanged Iran, but now we've got discussions with Iran on its knees about its nuclear program. And I would just note that it seemed that before the February 28th, Iran was pretty serious in nuclear talks. I mean, I think that the damage after the 12-day war in particular, it was pretty severe. And it seemed that there could have been a path towards some sort of an agreement. And we'll see how it goes with the new leadership in Tehran, which does seem to be very hard line, even relative to the prior regime. But we may get to a point at the end of this where they feel really crippled and they feel that making a deal on the nuclear program, giving up the right to enrich or having, extracting the nuclear material to a third country in exchange for some sanctions relief that will allow them to rebuild, maybe that is actually an attractive option, even for this leadership.
I assume that the U.S. would never actually pay quote unquote reparations to the state of
I
Iran.
don't think so.
Okay.
I think that they would allow for sanctions relief, which is part of that 15-point plan that originally floated, which would in effect be not in effect be a net check from the
Right.
U.S. government to Iran, right, for reparations, but that would be an economic lifeline similar to what they got in the JCPOA.
So let's talk for a moment about, and I do want to get to the economics in a moment, but I really want to ask you this question around
Yes.
the role that Putin and the Russian state plays in this, because I worry that Iran is being enabled by the Russians. This hardline regime is actually getting material assistance, whether it's replenishment and or intelligence. There was a news story around Trump allowing some oil to go
Yeah.
into Cuba, and that was something that the Russians were happy about. And I'm wondering whether or not, the relationship between Trump and Putin is such that he can potentially get Putin to, be a little bit less involved if he either is less involved in Ukraine or backs off on Cuba or what it may be. Can you give us your take on that, but preferably in English, please, rather than in Russian?
The So here's what I say: it's clear that Russia's one of, if not the biggest winner from this conflict. Given the sanctions relief and the evaporation of the discount of Ural crude relative to Brent, I mean, they're making, the combination of those two things at least $150 million more a day than they were before the conflict. And then now you have questions around whether or not the United States is going to be able to continue to provide, air defense to the Ukrainians, given the depletion of some of those munitions, and there are reports on that front around the Pentagon becoming concerned around that or weighing a potential reduction in relief there, and the overall U.S. adventurism for continued commitments may diminish in the wake of this conflict. And so Vladimir Putin gives him an economic lifeline, distracts the United States, and given some of the assistance that he's providing to Iran, gives him some bargaining chips, including on energy relief, but also it's clear that the Russians are providing some targeting assistance. I think even Trump admitted that when asked about it by reporters. And so maybe Putin, offers to be a kind of conduit for negotiations at some point or to apply pressure on the Iranians. So it gives him another chit in order to cash in on diminished support for Ukraine on the part of the United States. And so I think that they're a clear winner. In, in terms of what they're actually providing the Iranians and how essential, it's hard to tell. And I would assume that when it comes to some of the munitions that Iran is expending in and around the Strait of Hormuz and that they're firing at Gulf states, for example, that Iran is manufacturing and will continue to manufacture most of that and doesn't need Russia. Russia does have Shahed drone factories within Russia that it's running to, supply its war in Ukraine, but Iran has plenty of manufacturing capability for Shaheds at home.
Even after
There.
all this
Yeah.
bombing?
Yeah. I would assume that it is distributed, that some of it is fortified. The Iranians have been preparing for this, and it's relative to ballistic missiles and, launchers and all that. It's relatively cheap and, inexpensive and easier to manufacture. So I assume they're still producing.
But at a very diminished level or not?
I think it's fair to assume that it's diminished relative to February 28th, but they already had enormous stockpiles of thousands of these things, and relative to missiles, they can replenish more quickly their Shahed drone count. And I think that's the longer term risk. This goes on for months and months. It's not like they're going to necessarily run out of drones anytime soon. And that's what people are most fixated on, especially given the price mismatch between whatever it is, 35,000 or $50,000 Shahed drone and then a, $1 million plus US Patriot missile.
What about the strategic option for the president? Maybe it's more tactical, but to declare victory and to pull all the military assets effectively out of the region, not to shut the bases down, but to essentially say, look, we've weakened this regime sufficiently that I can declare victory. We'll come back and deal with the nuclear stuff at another time. But for now, we're just going to pull out, declare victory, and let the rest of the world deal with the Iranians as it relates to allowing anything to go through the Straits of Hormuz. Is that a viable option for the president?
I think that in many ways the administration would like to do that after they feel that they've sufficiently degraded Iran, just given some of the economic pressure. But I would assume that if they just got up and, one of the risks is if they just declared victory and walked away without any sort of agreement, that Iran would then continue to disrupt flows through the strait or seek to essentially extort countries who are looking to transit the strait by having to pay Iran in order to, get safe passage. And it would be very hard for the administration to abide by that. So the thinking would be that they keep up the pressure until Iran feels compelled to agree as part of a ceasefire to allow for the reopening of the strait rather than the U.S. just completely walking away.
I mean, it seems as though 98% of the tankers that go through there, whether they're tankers or cargo or whatever, all going to Asia. It's not coming to North America. And so the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians, they're not the ones that started the war. Let them figure that out with the
Well,
Iranians.
you hear that rhetoric. The challenge is that oil is a global market, and so despite the fact that all that stuff is going, 80 to 90% of it is going to Asia, you still have gasoline prices in the U.S. at $4 a gallon on average as a result of this conflict. So the U.S. is not insulated. It is insulated from a LNG perspective, right? I mean, U.S. domestic, natural gas prices haven't really changed much. So that reduces the kind of strain on the US, but it is affected like everybody else by the global nature of the oil market and therefore all the refined products, right? And then that's not even to mention all the fertilizer and aluminum. 9% of aluminum production comes from the Middle East. 30% of helium production, which is essential for microchips. So all that stuff is going to be disrupted and matters ultimately to the United States as well.
And while I appreciate there are certain types of hydrocarbon based material or actual hydrocarbons in raw form, like the very heavy crude that you need to put into tankers in order to move them around that we don't get domestically because we know we have the light sweet stuff, which is overall more valuable, but we don't have the really heavy stuff. We don't have the helium, etc. Is there an option for the administration to, in some way, become more self-sufficient so that we get the heavy stuff from Venezuela or we get the helium from elsewhere, but we essentially insulate our own energy supply in large part from the price shock that this conflict has caused? Is that even possible or not?
Again, on domestic natural gas prices, it does seem like we're insulated, but in general, and these global, markets and also these very complex supply chains, I think the idea of kind of autarky is really not feasible, especially anytime soon, right? So the U.S. economy is going to be feeling the pain if this continues to go on in a couple different dimensions.
So let's pivot to the very short time we have left and talk about the economy. If we get a meaningful reopening of the strait by the end of May, 50% of the traffic is reestablished, we'll say by the end of May,
Yeah.
75% by the end of June. Is it a fait accompli that we have a recession and the market is going to, in your mind, the market is going to reflect that? Or do you think that there's also a reasonable possibility that particularly the US economy is more resilient than that? We have gasoline is only 3 or 4% of consumption in this country. And if the stock market doesn't see the recession and that continues to hold up the high end consumer, and with all the fixed investment going on in AI, et cetera, that it's reasonable that we might be able to sustain a few months of this. Had 1 month behind us and maybe another 2 months. And we get to, by the end of 2 months, maybe 50, 75% of activity again. I mean, what's your take on all that?
I would say a couple of things. One is that in that scenario, right, that this goes on for a month or two. Remember, one of the assumptions is that the U.S. military is going to be focused on reopening the strait and trying to get some traffic, even if it's limited and it is navigated by convoy through the strait to relieve a little bit of that energy pressure. It's not going to get it up to the full flow that we had before February 28th, but that will provide maybe a little bit of relief. You also have some, workarounds. It's interesting. The strait, accounted for whatever, 20 million barrels a day of crude, refined products before February 28th. And now you look at various estimates. It seems that the reduction in global supply is somewhere on the order of around 10 million barrels a day, maybe even a little bit less because there are some bypass options. The
Mhm.
Saudi East-West pipeline, you've got a
Right.
little bit more capacity in UAE. Plus, you have Iranian ships still going through. That's almost 2 million barrels a day. You have safe passage of Pakistani, Turkish flagged ships, so that's going to add a little bit of flow, and then you have all of the strategic petroleum reserve releases coordinated by the IEA, the 400 million barrels. Maybe you get some re-upped amount. Japan has already called for an additional release, and then you have the steady drawdown of all of the oil that's at sea from Russia and Iran that they have the sanctions licenses added to allow for the export of those barrels. And so when you put together the ancillary relief and some of the bypass, it's not a 20% of global supply shut off right now. And so if you add on top of that a little bit of traffic through the strait with naval convoy, I think that in 2 months time, you will have there will definitely be stagflationary impact. I'm not sure you're in recession territory yet. Recession territory is you're between 150 $200 a barrel.
Yeah, I guess there's probably also, I don't know how material it is, but there's got to be some, what I'm going to call healthy elasticity of consumption, where there's going to be some conservation reduction without actually having a really negative impact on follow on GDP, right?
Yeah,
So,
I mean, there will be
uh,
some. There will be. I mean, as Javier Blas is the great Bloomberg columnist put it. We're entering kind of the demand destruction phase of this conflict, right?
sure.
And so you're going to have some of that come offline. The challenge is when you look at the scale, he pointed this out, which I thought was really interesting. The 10 million barrels a day offline reduction in global supply is equivalent to essentially the COVID shock. So that gives you a sense of the scale of demand destruction required to bring the market in balance. So that's why, the global economy, if this just continues in perpetuity, is in for, a pretty serious pain. And it's why I would assume that that pressure is going to catch up with the Trump administration, and especially when, married to the military clock of continually degrading Iran's assets, they'll get to a point where they'll say the pressure is high enough, plus we've done enough of a job in degrading Iran, plus we've opened the straits. It's now time to bring this to a close.
And I would have to say, just to close, I'll ask you for the last word in response to this. I can only imagine that clearly that administration miscalculated. They didn't expect to be where they are today, but if they knew that there was a risk of this degree of miscalculation, they wouldn't have done this 9 months before an election, a major domestic election, a cycle.
Well, no comment on that, on whether they necessarily miscalculated. My guess is that there are some in the administration who would look at the costs of this, and you could play the parlor game of who are the factions, right, that are for this war versus not within the Trump administration. There are probably some who think that this, if they anticipated this kind of an economic hit, they would have advised no. But look, Iran was a threat. I think that there was a view, the Israelis had it. There are parts of the, U.S. administration and the ecosystem that believe that Iran is historically weak right now after the 12-day war. And if you're going to have this kind of an operation to really, set Iran back by a number of years, it's best to do it now. Whether or not it was a miscalculation, I won't make a judgment, but it certainly was, I think, and this is a lot more extended and will have a lot more of a multi-dimensional and lasting economic effect than I think a lot of commentators anticipated in, February 27th. That's for sure.
Yep. Well, I don't envy the producers of our podcast that will have to work on the editing, because I think that there's not a word I would take out of the conversation. So thank you so much, Teddy.
My pleasure. Always good to be with you, and happy to come on again.
Yes. Well, hopefully it's going to be a happier conversation next time we speak, but it may be even a less rosy one. We'll have to see. Thanks so much for being here.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah. And for everybody that wants to listen to a full roundup of our thought leadership, please go to wilmingtontrust.com, and we'll be back again soon with another episode.
This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the sale of any financial product or service or recommendation or determination that any investment strategy is suitable for a specific investor. Investors should seek financial advice regarding the suitability of any investment strategy based on the investor's objectives, financial situation, and particular needs. The information on Wilmington Trust's capital considerations with Tony Roth has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, but its accuracy and completeness are not guaranteed. The opinions, estimates, and projections constitute the judgment of Wilmington Trust as of the date of this podcast and are subject to change without notice. The opinions of any guest on the Capital Considerations podcast who are not employed by Wilmington Trust or M&T Bank are their own and do not necessarily represent those of M&T Bank Corporate or any of its affiliates. Wilmington Trust is not authorized to and does not provide legal or tax advice. Our advice and recommendations provided to you is illustrative only and subject to the opinions and advice of your own attorney, tax advisor, or other professional advisor. Diversification does not ensure a profit or guarantee against a loss. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will be successful. Past performance cannot guarantee future results. Investing involves a risk, and you may incur a profit or a loss. Any reference to company names mentioned in the podcast should not be construed as investment advice or investment recommendations of those companies. Third-party trademarks and brands are the property of their respective owners. Third parties referenced herein are independent companies and are not affiliated with M&T Bank or Wilmington Trust. Listing them does not suggest a recommendation or endorsement by Wilmington Trust. Private market investments are only available to investors that meet the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's definition of qualified purchaser and accredited investor. Facts and views presented in this report have not been reviewed by and may not reflect information known to professionals in other business areas of Wilmington Trust or M&T Bank, and may provide or seek to provide financial services to entities referred to in this report. M&T Bank and Wilmington Trust have established information barriers between their various business groups. As a result, M&T Bank and Wilmington Trust do not disclose certain client relationships or compensation received from such entities in their reports. Investment products are not insured by the FDIC or any other governmental agency, are not deposits of or other obligations of or guaranteed by Wilmington Trust, M&T Bank, or any other bank or entity, and are subject to risks including a possible loss of the principal amount invested. Wilmington Trust is a registered service mark used in connection with various fiduciary and non-fiduciary services offered by certain subsidiaries of M&T Bank Corporation, including, but not limited to, Manufacturers and Traders Trust Company, M&T Bank, Wilmington Trust Company, WTC, operating in Delaware only, Wilmington Trust N.A., WTNA, Wilmington Trust Investment Advisors, Inc., WTIA, Wilmington Funds Management Corporation, WFMC, Wilmington Trust Asset Management, LLC, WTAM, and Wilmington Trust Investment Management, LLC, WTIM. Such services include trustee, custodial, agency, investment management, and other services. International corporate and institutional services are offered through M&T Bank Corporation's international subsidiaries. Loans, credit cards, retail and business deposits, and other business and personal banking services and products are offered by M&T Bank, member FDIC.
Copyright 2026.
M&T Bank and its affiliates and subsidiaries. All rights reserved.